Hello, I'm a couple counsellor and a family counsellor and a trainer working with Relate and in a private practice where my specialism is talking to people on the autistic spectrum. So our subject today is what we know about the autistic brain, and it's a useful starting point because I need to establish that autism is a real difference. Anybody who's been living undiagnosed with an autistic condition will have found other explanations for their behaviour, and other people will have found other explanations, such as it's their personality, it's their personal history, it's willful. And when we understand that autism is a real brain difference, we can say for sure, no, it's a biological difference. The brain is actually wired up differently from birth. And although upbringing and personality will play a part, it's a very small part in relation to the enormous difference which is autistic brain wiring. So my big point today is that autism is a real biological difference. And when we know that, we can take away some of the self-blame which people on the spectrum have used, and some of the blaming behaviour which people living with them have applied to people on the spectrum, because both of them were misunderstandings. The self-blame and the external blame were misunderstandings. So that's the big point I want to make today. But the smaller points are to do with what we've seen on brain scans, since we're now at a point in science for the very first time where we can watch brains in action while they're alive. And what brain scans tell us is suggestive about the inside story that people on the spectrum have experienced, and which they've shared with me and other counsellors when they come into counselling to talk about how it feels to be them. So the first common finding now from Brainstem scans and statistics is that the autistic brain is larger on average, but less organised. It goes through the same growth spurts as the neurotypical brain, but it doesn't go through the same pruning process. So it's a more capacious brain, but less efficient. And that matches well with the testimony of people on the spectrum who complain that they think themselves into exhaustion, but their thoughts aren't fruitful and effective. They're very prone to obsessionality, to repetitive thoughts, and guilty thoughts, anxious thoughts, which may be diagnosed as OCD or obsession or post-traumatic stress disorder. But actually, it's a very common symptom of being on the spectrum that thoughts are very intense, but quite, inefficient. They don't lead to a reasonable outcome. So that's the first point. It's a big brain, but it's not well organised. A second finding is that the autistic brain is weakly connected left and right. The bundle of connections here at the back is statistically smaller in the autistic brain. And that's also true for the male brain as opposed to the female brain, which is a thought-provoking thing in itself, because autism has been called the extreme male brain. If these connections are less substantial, then the left and right brain are communicating less with each other. and therefore sharing their strengths less effectively. And that could well explain why, for the autistic brain, connecting thoughts and feelings comes very difficult. It's not a natural thing to do. When the autistic brain is thinking, it's thinking. When it's feeling, it's feeling. But it's not good at reporting on that experience. And so when a counsellor says to somebody on the spectrum, what do you feel about such and such? The answer is commonly, I don't know. And it's an honest answer. The person is not hiding their feeling. They're not playing games. They honestly don't know. But it does seem to them that counselling itself is a game which they need to master, but which they don't grasp the rules of. And that's because counselling is built on the idea that the brain is neurotypical and the client can access their feelings in words. So the thoughts and words are effectively linked with the other side of the brain. But in the autistic brain, this seems to be less the case. Another part of that observation about linking is that the pathways in the autistic brain, the pathways from the brain as a whole to the frontal cortex, which is the newest part of our evolutionary brain, those pathways are not strong and effective. So that could correlate with the very common observation that the autistic brain lacks so-called executive function, meaning what to do when, how to go about doing things and being effective. This part of the brain is where we make our social adjustments, where we reckon with the rules of society, where we comment on our own behaviour and we can inhibit it. We might have a desire, so to speak, to scratch, but at a dinner party, we don't do it. This part of the brain says no. If this isn't well wired in the autistic brain, it would explain why people on the spectrum come over often as very spontaneous or very disinhibited, because they're not commenting in advance on their own behaviour. But it's also the part of the brain where we plan and execute our plans. And if that's not well wired, then the autistic brain doesn't know easily what to do with itself, how to get through the day, how to coordinate getting up, getting dressed, having breakfast, getting out of the house. And it's a very common experience for people on the spectrum that managing their day, managing time, is much more of a challenge to them than it appears to be to people who are so-called neurotypical. Somehow other people float through the day getting things done sequentially and effectively. The autistic person gets through the day in fits and starts, not always finishing what they started, not always knowing what to do next, and sometimes getting so absorbed in a task that they lose track of time and don't realise they've missed 2 meals, or somebody's been knocking on the door for half an hour. They are out of it because they're so caught up in their own tunnel vision and concentration that they have lost contact with the external world. Another thing which is now very well testified to and increasingly understood in scientific terms is that the autistic brain experiences and reports on the senses differently. And the senses seem to be operating either above normal hypersensitivity, or below normal, hyposensitivity. So it's very common for people on the spectrum to say they're very sensitive to sound or light, and relatively insensitive to external temperature or pain. So we hear stories in counselling about managing very severe injury without appropriate levels of suffering. I've heard about somebody who was able to tolerate extraordinary damage to their leg in diabetes, and so reluctant to go to the doctor that it ended in an amputation. And the doctor was bewildered by how the patient had tolerated their distress, and the patient was bewildered that they needed an amputation because the message, so to speak, hadn't got through. But being very, very oversensitive to other stimuli is a common story, as I say. People who can't pay attention in counselling because of the traffic noise outside, which the counsellor has learned to ignore. A dripping tap, somebody sniffing in the office, or a kid at school who can't tolerate the sound of a pencil on paper. And when the kid next to him is writing, it's overwhelming to him, the unpleasantness of that noise, and it prevents him from getting on with his own work. And if that kid were to complain to the teacher about the noise, the teacher would naturally say, "Don't be silly, concentrate, don't make up excuses." But it's actually the truth. For the kids, that noise is 5 or 10 times louder than the teacher can believe. And because of the way the autistic brain is wired, it's not easy for the kid to tell himself that it's not important enough to fret about. He can't put it out of his mind, to use the phrase which neurotypicals use. And this is one of the big factors in children's misbehaviour. Is when they are, as it were, new to themselves and new to the world, they take their sensory information as primary, and they respond very, very strongly to sensory information, whether it's that noise of scratching or the feeling of discomfort at the label in their school uniform here, which classically children on the spectrum ask their parents to get rid of. The wise parent takes labels out of clothing and is observant of the child's objections to whatever fabrics bother the kid. Lots of kids hate the feeling of wool. Others are offended by, I don't know, a school t-shirt which has nylon in it. And when a wise parent realises that there's only one cotton t-shirt that really works for their kid, they're well advised to buy 10 and keep them in storage until they're needed, because the difficulty that sensory problem causes the child is just not worth fighting with. It's a fact from the kid's point of view, and a wise parent goes along with that fact. So the sensory information is distorted in the autistic brain. The autistic brain is weakly connected left and right and front and back. It's larger, it's less pruned, and lastly, it's permanently anxious. We see a differently shaped amygdala in the brain of even babies on the autistic spectrum. And we see the brainstem responding to hyperanxiety by raising the heart rate and the breathing rate. And this is really, really significant for an autistic life. If the alarm system is pressed more or less permanently on red alert, then the brainstem is constantly interfering with the more sophisticated functions of the brain. The brainstem is there to keep us alive. It's where we get the impulse to run or fight or freeze. It's one question is, can I eat that thing or will it eat me? It's two questions, but they're both very black and white and extreme. And that accounts for a lot of intensity and fear in the autistic mind. If the biggest question the autistic brainstem is positing is, will I survive? Then all social life and the average management of the day is overcast by a quality of terror which belongs only to the question, will I survive? So this anxiety is a real nuisance in creating a distorted worldview and creating body stress for the person on the spectrum. And it's probably the reason why the most central diagnostic factor for counsellors in dealing with people on the spectrum is not to say that they are this or that in itself, but that whatever they do it to an extreme. Their behaviour seems to be unmodulated, and that's what I'm attributing to the lack of connections to the frontal cortex. So there is great feeling in autism. It's not a lack of feeling that's characteristic of the spectrum in my experience. There's great feeling, but it's too much for the occasion. It's the feeling often associated with a frightened animal. The feeling can be, I've got to fight because I'm endangered. I've got to flee, avoid, hide, get out of a situation, again, because I'm in danger. Or I should freeze to make myself small because I don't know any other way of handling this. So classic autistic postures are paranoia, anxiety, avoidance, going missing. And on the other side not of feeling but the side of thinking, it's again characteristic of autistic thoughts that they're over the top. They're super logical, super perfectionist, super systemic, super detailed, super precise. All of those things are characteristic of a supercomputer, where precision and detail and sequence are the essence of good functioning. And it's no surprise that it's people on the spectrum who invented the computer and the whole world of IT, which we all now live in and benefit from. But those qualities of perfectionism and systematization and the all or nothing demand of the left brain, all of that fits rather badly with ordinary social life, in which people cannot be strictly regulated and we can't know always what they'll do. We have to make space for each other. We have to be flexible. And that's the stuff which the autistic brain has to learn by trial and error, and finds it quite painful to learn because it's not logical, it's not rational, and it can't be systematized. So these are the main things we know about the autistic brain at the moment. And I'm hoping that some part of the description has been useful to you, because, as is always said, when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. But when you've met many autistic people and heard their stories across many hours of counselling, as I have, you do see some generalities, and some generalisations hold enough water to make a description of the autistic brain worthwhile. And that's what I've tried to share with you from my experience today. My next talk will be about anxiety and anxiety management. Thank you.